Ma'am, I thought I made myself clear yesterday. You are not welcome here.
The command, sharp and cold, sliced through the warm, charitable air of the Thanksgiving food drive in Cedar Creek's town square. Officer Brody Evans stood rigid, his presence a block of ice in the cheerful autumn morning. 30 years of service had honed his instincts into what he believed was a razor's edge, a gut feeling that could sniff out trouble from a mile away. It was this instinct that had helped him corner armed robbers and unmask liars with a single, steady gaze. And right now, it was screaming at him as he stared down the unfamiliar black woman who had dared to show her face in his town for a second day. She was an outsider, a loose thread in the fabric of the community he had sworn to protect, and he was the needle that would pull it out. Eleanor Vance, who had been about to place a bag of canned goods on the donation table, looked up, her expression unnervingly calm. "Officer, this is a community event. I believe I have as much right to be here as anyone." Brody let out a cold scoff, loud enough to silence the nearby chatter. "Right? Your rights end where the safety of my town begins. I saw you snooping around the old mill yesterday, and now you're here. To me, that's suspicious behavior." He punctuated the sentence by placing his hand firmly on the grip of his holstered pistol, a gesture of dominance that made a young mother nearby instinctively pull her child closer. Across the square, an old veteran in a VFW hat slowly shook his head in dismay, but Brody was too consumed by his own righteous authority to notice. He was the guardian of this town, the protector of its peace. However, it was this very instinct that Brody was so proud of, this blind act of power before the town he loved, that was the shovel he used to dig the grave for a career he'd spent a lifetime building. Because Brody could never have imagined that just as he was about to escalate his threat, the doors of the town hall would swing open, and Mayor Thompson would emerge, beaming. "Eleanor, there you are!" The mayor's voice boomed across the silent square. "We were just about to send a search party. Welcome to Cedar Creek. I'm so glad our new chief of police could make it to the food drive." The title chief of police crashed down on Brody with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from his face as he stared, frozen, his hand still resting on his weapon. The woman he had just publicly humiliated, the woman he had treated like a criminal, was not just a citizen. She was his new boss. That catastrophic moment in the town square had been a storm gathering for days, its first clouds forming just 24 hours earlier in the warm, familiar confines of the Cedar Plate Diner. The bell above the door had jingled, admitting a gust of cold November air, but inside the world remained unchanged. The low, mournful rumble of a Johnny Cash song played from the corner jukebox as Brenda May expertly worked the grill, the scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee hanging thick and comforting. In his usual booth, Officer Brody Evans was king of his small castle, a half-finished crossword puzzle from the local paper sitting next to his coffee mug. Across from him, his two oldest friends, Dave and Hank, were deep in their daily ritual of complaint. 30 years we did just fine without a stoplight at Elm and Main," Dave grumbled. "Now it's just another reason for folks to be late." Brody nodded in agreement, filling in a word. "It's progress, Dave, or so they tell us." "Oh." His voice was laced with a familiar cynicism. The conversation inevitably shifted to the real source of the town's anxiety. "Still no word on who the new chief is?" Hank asked, leaning forward. "Just that they're from Atlanta," Brody said, the name of the city tasting like an insult. "Some city slicker the council hired after they pushed a good man like Chief Henderson out the door." He tapped his pen on the table, the memory of his friend's forced retirement still a fresh wound. It was then that Dave sighed. "I don't know, Brody. Things are just changing too fast." The simple phrase seemed to strike a deeper chord in Brody. He fell silent, his gaze distant. He quietly pulled out his phone, swiped to a photo, and stared at it for a long moment. It was his late wife, Mary, her face bright with laughter at the town's fall festival years ago, a slice of Brenda May's famous peach cobbler in her hand. A wave of profound sadness washed over him. "And Mary loved this town just the way it was," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The parades, the potlucks, all of it. I just want to keep things the way she loved them." Dave and Hank looked at each other, understanding the depth of his words. His resistance wasn't just about a new stoplight or a new boss. It was a desperate attempt to hold on to a world that no longer contained the person he loved most. He put the phone away, his expression hardening again. The grief had passed, leaving behind only a stubborn resolve. Just as Brody slid his phone back into his pocket, the bell on the diner door jingled again, a sharp, clear sound that cut through the low rumble of conversation. A brief hush fell as the regulars turned to look. Eleanor Vance stepped inside, bringing a swirl of cold November air with her. She paused for a moment, her eyes calmly scanning the room, taking in the worn checkerboard floor and the faded photographs on the walls. To her, it was a piece of the town's history. To Brody, her stillness looked like a predator assessing its territory. He watched, his eyes narrowing, as she took a seat at the far end of the counter. He cataloged every detail through his biased filter. The simple gray turtleneck was not elegant, but drab. The lack of makeup or jewelry was not professional, but a sign of someone who didn't care to fit in. Brenda May approached with a coffee pot. "Coffee, hon?" she asked, her voice warm and welcoming to all. "A cup of hot tea would be wonderful, thank you," Eleanor replied, her own voice calm and measured. Brody nudged Hank under the table. "Tea," he whispered with a smirk. "See what I mean? City folk." He saw her quiet observation of the other patrons, not as curiosity, but as calculation. She wasn't just passing through. She was looking for something or someone. After she finished her tea, Eleanor left a crisp $5 bill on the counter for the $2 drink, a generous tip that, in Brody's mind, was an oddly flashy gesture for someone dressed so plainly. He watched through the large front window as she walked to a 10-year-old, unassuming Ford sedan. This detail pleased him, confirming his judgment that she was of little importance. But then, instead of turning left toward the highway that would take her out of his town, she turned right, heading toward the older, more neglected neighborhood by the river. That was it. For Brody, it was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. No tourist, no respectable visitor went to that part of town. His suspicion, which had started as a quiet cloud, now solidified into a block of ice in his gut. He pulled out his small, worn notepad and a pen. "I'm keeping an eye on her," he declared to his friends, his voice low and serious as he scribbled down her license plate number. His duty, as he saw it, was now perfectly clear. He stood up, leaving his half-finished coffee on the table, and gave Brenda May a nod. "Duty calls," he said, a grim sense of purpose in his eyes. "Time to see what our visitor is really up to." For a man like Brody Evans, suspicion was a hunger, and after the morning's encounter, he was starving. So when he saw the stranger's car parked by the skeletal remains of the old mill that afternoon, it felt like a feast, a full-course meal of vindication that he was about to enjoy. He had been on patrol, telling himself he was just making his usual rounds, but his cruiser seemed to drift of its own accord toward the forgotten edges of Cedar Creek. The old textile mill stood as a monument to a bygone era, its brick walls streaked with rust, its hundreds of windows shattered like vacant eyes staring out at nothing. A faded "no trespassing" sign hung crookedly on a chain-link fence, a warning few people ever needed. But there it was, the same unassuming Ford sedan, parked on the gravel shoulder. A grim, tight smile touched Brody's lips. His hunch had been dead on. He parked his cruiser just around a bend, hidden from view, and approached on foot. He moved with a practiced silence, his boots barely crunching on the gravel, his hand resting casually near the butt of his holstered weapon. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the familiar thrill of the hunt. Eleanor Vance was standing on the access road, her back to him, studying the crumbling facade of the main building. Brody stepped out from behind a rusted iron gate, his voice sharp and loud, designed to startle. "Ma'am, this is private property." She turned, but not with the jolt of surprise he expected. Her movements were slow, deliberate. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice even. He ignored the pleasantry, striding closer. "The sign says no trespassing. Are you lost?" The question was an insult disguised as a concern. "Not at all," Eleanor replied, her eyes meeting his without a flicker of fear. "I'm exactly where I mean to be. And for the record, I'm standing on a public access road, not on the mill's property. Her calm correction was like a spark on dry tinder. She was challenging his observation, his authority. I'm going to need to see some identification, he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Yet she did not reach for a purse or a wallet. I don't believe I'm required to do that, officer, she stated politely but firmly. I haven't broken any laws. You have no legal cause to detain me or demand my papers. The sheer audacity of her response stunned him into a brief silence. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by an outsider who quoted the law back to him. Brody's face flushed a deep, angry red. Every instinct screamed at him to escalate, to pull this defiant woman from her car and show her what real authority looked like. But something in her unwavering gaze held him back. It wasn't the fear he was used to seeing in people he confronted. It was a profound, unshakable confidence that unnerved him. He was a man used to wielding a hammer, and she was responding like she was made of water, not stone. Unable to win the argument on legal grounds, he fell back on the sheer force of his position. He took one more deliberate step toward her, his voice a low growl. This is your one and only warning. Get in your car and leave the area, or your afternoon is going to get a lot more complicated. He let the threat hang in the cold air between them. Eleanor held his gaze for another long beat, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. As you wish, officer, she said, her voice still infuriatingly even. She turned, got into her car without another word, and drove away. He watched her go, a bitter sense of victory in his chest. He had made her leave. He had won. The cold November wind cut through Eleanor's coat as she drove, but it was the chill of the encounter that went deeper. Still, she was not shaken. Instead of heading for the highway, she found herself turning back toward the center of town, drawn to the one place that had offered a flicker of warmth. The bell at the Cedar Plate Diner jingled softly as she re-entered. The lunch rush was over, and the diner was quiet. Brenda May looked up from wiping the counter, a hint of surprise in her eyes. Back so soon, hun? You look chilled to the bone. Eleanor slid onto a stool at the counter. Just needed a cup of tea to warm up. Brenda May nodded, her expression kind. That officer, he seems very passionate about this town's history, Eleanor said, a masterful understatement. The comment opened a door. What can you tell me about the old mill? Brenda May's face softened with a wave of nostalgia. Oh, that place, she sighed, placing a steaming mug before Eleanor. My own mother worked there for 30 years. Used to say the whole town's heartbeat was the sound of those looms. Hard to believe it's just sitting there, rotting away. In that small moment of shared history, a quiet connection was forged between the two women. Eleanor left the diner a few minutes later, feeling the warmth of the tea in her hands and a renewed sense of the town's true character, a character found not in the angry officer with a badge, but in the gentle wisdom of the woman who ran the diner. While Eleanor found a moment of quiet connection, Brody Evans sat stewing in his patrol car a few blocks away, the silence amplifying his irritation. The feeling of victory he'd had at the mill had faded, replaced by the nagging memory of her calm, intelligent eyes. She hadn't acted scared. She had acted entitled. People who were scared were predictable. People who were entitled were dangerous. They thought the rules didn't apply to them. He gripped his radio handset, his knuckles white. This ambiguity had to end. Dispatch, this is Unit 3, he said, his voice clipped. Got a plate for you to run. He read out the Georgia license plate number he had meticulously written down in his notepad. Victor Alpha, November 287. The dispatcher's calm voice acknowledged the request, followed by the familiar hiss of radio static. Brody waited, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the steering wheel. His mind raced, constructing narratives. Maybe she was a private investigator digging up dirt for some lawsuit, or a con artist scouting the town for her next mark. Every scenario that flashed through his mind was sinister, each one confirming his initial judgment. The radio crackled back to life. Unit 3, that plate comes back registered to a state holding company. Main office is in Atlanta. There's no individual name listed on the registration. Brody felt a hot surge of frustration. A holding company. It was a blank wall. Anonymous. Corporate. It was the kind of bureaucratic shield people used when they were hiding something. To him, this wasn't just a lack of information, it was a deliberate act of concealment. She had challenged his authority, quoted the law at him, and her identity was hidden behind a faceless corporate entity. The pieces in his mind formed a dark and threatening picture. His suspicion was no longer a hunch. It was a certainty. He slammed the radio handset back into its cradle with a sharp crack of plastic. His jaw was set, his eyes cold and hard. The next time he saw her, there would be no more questions, no more warnings. There would only be the assertion of his control. He muttered to himself in the empty car, "I don't care who you are. In my town, you play by my rules." For Officer Brody Evans, the Thanksgiving food drive was the heart of Cedar Creek, a sacred display of community. Seeing the woman there felt like a sacrilege. He wasn't just a cop approaching a suspect anymore. He was a guardian protecting his temple from a demon he was determined to exorcise in front of the entire congregation. The town square was alive with a spirit of generosity that pushed back against the crisp November chill. Neighbors laughed and chatted, placing bags of groceries onto long folding tables, piled high with cans of cranberry sauce, boxes of stuffing mix, and hefty frozen turkeys. The scent of pine from a nearby Christmas tree sale mingled with the smell of hot cider being served from a large urn. Mayor Thompson was in his element, shaking hands and patting backs, while Brenda May, a pillar of the community, helped organize the donations with a warm efficiency. Standing near one of the tables was Eleanor Vance. She held a small bag of her own contributions, quietly observing the scene not as an outsider, but with a look of genuine appreciation for the town's spirit. A faint, gentle smile touched her lips. It was this picture of idyllic harmony that Brody Evans walked into on his foot patrol. For a moment, a surge of pride swelled in his chest. This was his town. This was the peace he had dedicated his life to preserving. It was perfect. And then he saw her. His eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto Eleanor. The warmth in his chest instantly turned to ice. All the obsessive frustration from the day before, the defiance at the mill, the anonymous registration, the challenge to his authority came rushing back. Her calm presence in the middle of his sacred town square felt like a mockery. He didn't see a citizen participating in a charity event. He saw an intruder, a contamination. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of grim resolve. His purpose, which had been to simply walk the beat, suddenly sharpened into a single, unyielding point. He had to remove her. He squared his shoulders, the friendly neighborhood cop persona dissolving away, replaced by the unbending enforcer. He began to walk toward her, his path direct and unwavering. A few people noticed the change in his demeanor and instinctively stepped aside, their cheerful conversations faltering as a sudden, unspoken tension began to ripple through the crisp autumn air. He stopped directly in front of Eleanor, standing too close, a deliberate invasion of her personal space designed to intimidate. The cheerful chatter around them faltered and died. Every eye was now on them. "Ma'am, I thought I made myself clear yesterday," he began, his voice low but carrying with sharp authority. "You are not welcome here." Eleanor looked from his hard face to the small bag of groceries in her hand. Canned corn, green beans, a box of stuffing. "Officer, this is a public event for charity," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I am here to make a donation, just like everyone else." Brody let out a humorless smirk. "I know what you are," he said, loud enough for the nearest onlookers to hear clearly. "I saw you snooping around the old mill yesterday. Now you show up here. To me, that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern." His voice rose, dripping with accusation. "I don't know what you're planning, but it's not happening in my town. Not on my watch." The open hostility was shocking. A young mother who had been explaining the food drive to her daughter quietly took the child's hand and pulled her a few steps back, creating a visible space around the confrontation. Across the square, Mr. Henderson, an elderly veteran in a VFW hat who had known Brody his whole life, slowly shook his head, a look of profound disappointment clouding his face. Eleanor's gaze remained locked on Brody, her expression unreadable. "I am breaking no laws, officer. You are harassing me." The word harassing was a lit match. Brody's face darkened. "I am ensuring the safety of this community," he boomed, puffing out his chest. "Something you clearly know nothing about." In this town, safety comes before feelings, ma'am. And right now, you are making my town feel unsafe. He relished the power of the moment, the feeling of all eyes on him, the silent crowd his captive audience. He was the protector, and she was the threat. It was all so simple. But then she spoke again, her voice still quiet, yet it seemed to cut through his authority like glass. "The only thing that feels unsafe here, officer," she said with deliberate clarity, "is your unprofessional conduct." That was it, the final trigger. Her calm clinical assessment of his behavior severed the last thread of his professional control. The crowd saw Officer Brody Evans' face turn a blotchy, dangerous shade of red. He took a half step forward, his body radiating a palpable heat of pure fury. "Unprofessional?" he hissed, his voice a low growl. He reached down, and in the dead silence of the town square, the sound of the leather retaining strap on his holster unsnapping made a loud, ominous click. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't have to. He simply placed his hand firmly on the checkered grip of his pistol, a universally understood threat that sucked the remaining air out of the plaza. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "In my town," he snarled, emphasizing each word, "I am the authority, and I'm done giving you warnings. You can either turn around and walk away right now, or the only place you'll be spending Thanksgiving is in a holding cell. It's your choice." Abram, the humiliation was absolute, a chilling display of raw power in a place of charity. The crowd was frozen, horrified. Brenda May felt a single hot tear of pure rage and helplessness trace a path down her cheek. Brody stood tall, savoring his victory, the weight of his hand on his gun a comforting affirmation of his control. But just as he was about to order her to move, the grand oak doors of the town hall swung open. Mayor Thompson stepped out into the sunlight, beaming, completely oblivious to the silent drama gripping the square. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Eleanor. His smile widened as he strode forward, his voice booming with cheerful hospitality, shattering the tension. "Eleanor, there you are. We were just about to send a search party. Welcome to Cedar Creek. I'm so glad our new chief of police could make it to the food drive." The words, cheerful and innocent, hung in the air for a moment before they landed. Chief of police. Brody's mind went blank. The sounds of the square faded into a dull roar in his ears. He stared at her, then at the smiling mayor, then back at her. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. His hand was still resting on his gun, but it now felt as heavy as lead, a monument to the single greatest mistake of his life. Freeze frame on Brody's face, his hand still on his gun, his mouth slightly agape in utter, career-ending horror. The mayor's cheerful words, "Our new chief of police," didn't just hang in the cold November air. They crashed down upon Officer Brody Evans with the force of a physical blow. In the deafening silence that followed, a silence so profound he could hear the frantic drumming of his own heart, 3 decades of pride, authority, and certainty shattered into a million pieces on the brick-paved square of the town he swore to protect. Time itself seemed to warp and slow. Mayor Thompson's smile faltered, his cheerful expression melting into confusion as he sensed the electric, toxic tension in the air. He looked from Eleanor's unnervingly calm face to Brody's, which had gone a ghostly shade of pale. "Brody, is everything all right here?" he stammered, his voice a small, uncertain thing in the vast silence. No one answered. A wave of collective understanding was washing through the crowd of townspeople. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry grass. Eyes widened as the impossible truth settled in. The expressions aimed at Brody shifted in an instant. The shock at his aggression was replaced by a new, more profound shock at his monumental, public error. They looked at Eleanor now with a dawning sense of awe and respect, and then their gazes would shift back to Brody, their hometown officer, with a devastating mixture of pity and contempt. Through the fog of his horror, Brody became aware of his own hand, still resting heavily on the grip of his pistol. The checkered plastic felt alien, searingly hot, a brand marking him as a fool. His fingers felt stiff, clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. Slowly, mechanically, he forced his hand to move, to lift away from the weapon and fall limply to his side. The movement was an act of complete and utter surrender, a white flag raised in a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. Throughout it all, Eleanor Vance remained perfectly still, her composure absolute. She gave the flustered mare a brief professional nod, a silent assurance that she had the situation under control. In that moment, without raising her voice or moving a muscle, she took command of the entire town square. The power had not just shifted, it had been reversed with the force of an avalanche. Eleanor let the silence hang in the air for one long, heavy moment, allowing the full weight of the situation to settle upon Brody's shoulders. She then turned her complete, undivided attention to him, the crowd, the mayor, everything else faded away. There were only the two of them now. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and carried an undeniable authority that cut through the square. "Officer Evans," she said, the title now sounding formal and distant. "My office. Now." It was not a request. It was the first official command from their new chief of police. For Brody, the order was almost a relief, a release from the frozen paralysis of his public humiliation. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, unable to meet her eyes. His gaze was fixed on the brick pavers at his feet as he turned, his body feeling like a stranger's, heavy and uncooperative. He began the walk across the square toward the police station. It was the longest 100 yards of his life. Each step was a fresh torment. He passed the town gazebo, and a brilliant, painful memory flared in his mind. Standing on those very steps 10 years ago, receiving a commendation for bravery from the old mayor, the whole town applauding, his wife Mary beaming in the front row. The memory was warm and golden, a stark contrast to the cold, judgmental stares he felt on his back now. The sound of whispers followed him, a rustling wave of condemnation. He passed the spot where the town's Christmas tree was raised every year, and another memory pierced him. Mary, her hands adjusting the sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, her breath making a small cloud in the winter air as she laughed. He looked up from the pavement, and his eyes met Brenda May's. She was standing on the steps of her diner, her arms crossed. Her expression wasn't angry, it was worse. It was filled with a deep, profound disappointment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned her back on him and went inside. The simple gesture was a physical blow, a clear message that the heart of the town had just closed its door on him. He reached the steps of the police station and hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the familiar brass handle. For 3 decades, this building had been his sanctuary, a symbol of his identity and power. Now it felt like a courthouse where he was the one on trial. He pushed the door open. The little bell attached to it, a sound he normally never even registered, jingled with what sounded like mocking cheerfulness in the tense silence. Behind the high front desk sat Mark, a young dispatcher Brody had coached in Little League. The kid's usual bright, easygoing greeting of, "Hey, Brody," was gone. Instead, Mark looked up with wide, uncertain eyes, a deer caught in the headlights. He swallowed hard before speaking, his voice stiff and formal. "Chief Vance radioed ahead," he said, avoiding Brody's gaze. "She said for you to wait in the briefing room, sir." That single word, "sir," was a wall built between them. It wasn't the sound of respect. It was the sound of distance, of a new and formal hierarchy that Brody was now at the bottom of. Brody gave a single jerky nod and walked down the short hallway, each step echoing loudly. He pushed open the door to the briefing room, a place where his voice had commanded attention for years. He had given hundreds of morning briefings at the head of the long, polished table. Now he walked to a chair at the far end and sat down, a visitor in his own domain. The room was empty, the silence pressing in on him. He stared at his own reflection in the dark, unlit screen of the presentation monitor on the wall. He didn't see the heroic protector of Cedar Creek. He saw a pale, tired old man, his shoulders slumped in his uniform, his eyes hollowed out by shock and a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. He had to finally face the man he had become. The silence was broken by the sound of distinct, confident footsteps approaching in the hallway. The sound jolted Brody from his trance. He heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door. He straightened his back, braced himself, and prepared to face the woman he had tried to break, who now held the power to break him completely. News in a small town travels faster than fire in a dry field, and the story of Officer Brody Evans's public downfall was a wildfire. By lunchtime, every occupied booth in the Cedar Plate Diner buzzed with the tale, and the court of public opinion was officially in session, with Brenda May presiding as the judge. The usual clatter of forks on plates and the sizzle of burgers on the grill were drowned out by a low, intense hum of hushed conversations. At the corner booth, Dave, who had been sitting with Brody that very morning, was holding court, trying to mount a defense for his friend. "Look, I'm not saying Brody was right," he argued to the men at his table, "but his heart's in the right place. He's just old school. This new chief, she comes in here from the big city, and she doesn't understand our ways. Brody was just being protective." Brenda May, refilling their coffee cups, overheard his comment. She set the coffee pot down on the table with a firm, deliberate click that drew their attention. "Dave," she began, her voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the table. "Old school is holding the door for a lady. It's tipping your hat. It is not threatening an unarmed woman in the middle of a charity event because you don't like her face." Dave started to protest, but Brenda May continued, her gaze steady. "That woman, Eleanor, she came back in here yesterday, all by herself, after Brody gave her a hard time out at the mill. She sat right there at my counter and had a cup of tea. She was polite as could be. We had a nice chat. She asked me about the town's history, about my mother working in the mill." She looked around at the listening faces. "What Brody did this morning wasn't old school. It wasn't protective. It was just plain wrong, and all of you know it." Her words, backed by the authority of her own first-hand experience, landed with undeniable force. The weak defenses for Brody crumbled. The men in the booth fell silent, staring into their coffee cups. The gossip hadn't just been a story, it was now a moral judgment. The town was wrestling with the uncomfortable truth that one of its lifelong heroes had acted like a villain, and the stranger had acted with a grace he had denied her. While the town debated his character, Brody Evans waited in the silent briefing room. In the chief's office, a space still filled with the ghosts of its previous occupant, Eleanor Vance was not concerned with gossip. She was concerned with facts. The office was sparse, with a few packed boxes in one corner and faded rectangles on the walls where old awards had been hastily removed. The phone on her desk rang, a shrill intrusion into the quiet. It was Mayor Thompson, his voice hurried and laced with panic. "Eleanor, it's a disaster," he began without any preamble. "The whole town is talking. You have to fire him, immediately. We need to send a strong, clear message that this kind of behavior isn't tolerated in Cedar Creek." Eleanor listened patiently, her gaze steady on the town square outside her window. "I appreciate your input, Mayor," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to his anxiety. "But I will handle my department's disciplinary matters internally and by the book. A reactionary decision serves politics, not justice." She ended the call politely but firmly, leaving no room for further argument. Then she turned to her computer. She did not open Brody's file, not yet. Instead, she pulled up two documents on a split screen. On the right was Brody's nearly 30-year service record. On the left was the termination report for his predecessor, Chief Henderson. Her eyes scanned the official, bureaucratic language of Henderson's file until she found the key passage. "Termination," she read quietly to herself, "is recommended due to repeated failures to address citizen complaints regarding officer misconduct and biased policing, creating a pattern of systemic neglect." There it was, the diagnosis of the disease. She looked at the words for a long moment, a quiet confirmation of what she had suspected. Brody wasn't just a single bad apple. He was a product of an orchard that had been allowed to rot from the top down, a culture where instinct was encouraged over accountability and complaints were swept under the rug. Firing him would be like cutting off a single poison branch. It would look decisive, but the roots of the problem would remain. Her decision, she now realized, couldn't just be about one man's mistake. It had to be about the future of the entire department. Having seen the blueprint of the problem, Eleanor Vance was ready to face the symptom. She pressed the button on her desk intercom. "Please send Officer Evans in," she said, her voice calm and steady. Brody entered a moment later, his posture rigid, his face a grim mask. He had spent the last hour in the briefing room preparing for a tirade, a lecture, the final, angry dismissal he was sure he deserved. He had rehearsed apologies and defenses in his head until the words were meaningless. Eleanor gestured to the simple wooden chair opposite her desk. "Sit down, officer," she said. He sat, the chair groaning under his weight. She didn't speak immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze not angry, but analytical, as if she were a geologist studying a rock, trying to understand its composition. The silence stretched, far more unnerving than any shouting match would have been. Finally, she asked a single quiet question that cut through all of his prepared defenses. "Why?" Brody was thrown. The question was too simple, too vast. He stammered, falling back on the crumbling foundation of his 30-year career. "My instinct," he began, his voice raspy. 30 years on this force, you develop a gut feeling. I saw someone who didn't belong, who was acting suspiciously at the mill. I made a judgment call to protect my town." He finished, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Eleanor listened patiently until he was done, her hands folded on the desk. "Let's talk about that," she said, her tone even. "You saw a woman in plain clothes. You didn't see a weapon. You didn't witness a crime. At the mill, when I correctly stated the law, you interpreted it as defiance. At the food drive, when I participated in a community event, you interpreted it as a threat. You didn't act on evidence, officer. You acted on a narrative you created in your own head." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his. "Your instinct wasn't instinct. It was prejudice. And the file of your previous chief shows a pattern of this department encouraging and ignoring that exact behavior for years. This culture of instinct over evidence ends today. This isn't just about your mistake, officer. It's about the future of this entire department." The quiet finality of her words was devastating. She had not just judged him, she had diagnosed him and the entire system he was a part of. She closed the file folder on her desk. The soft thud of the cardboard echoed in the silent room. "I have made my decision," she said, her eyes locking onto his. Brody held his breath, waiting for the axe to fall. Thanksgiving week in Cedar Creek was supposed to be about celebrating the harvest and giving thanks. For Brody Evans, it had become a season of bitter reckoning. He never could have predicted that the person he had wronged the most would be the one to offer him not the punishment he deserved, but the one thing he desperately needed, a path forward. He sat before her desk, a condemned man waiting for the swing of the axe. He braced himself for the words, "You're fired," but they never came. "You're not fired, Officer Evans," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but absolute. Brody looked up, his mind struggling to process the words. It felt like a trick, a reprieve he hadn't earned. Eleanor saw the confusion on his face and leaned forward slightly. "Firing you would be easy," she explained, her tone measured and analytical. "The mayor would be happy. It would look decisive, but it would be a waste. It would solve the immediate problem of Brody Evans, but it wouldn't begin to fix the underlying disease in this department. I was not hired to trim branches, I was hired to heal the tree, and that requires more than an axe." She let that sink in before continuing. "Instead, you are suspended for 2 weeks, effective immediately, without pay. When you return, you will be permanently reassigned." She paused. "I am creating a new position within this department, a role I believe is essential for our future. It's called the Community Liaison Officer, and you, Officer Evans, will be the first to hold that title. Your weapon will be a notepad, and your patrol car will be your own 2 feet." Brody could only stare, bewildered. This was not a punishment he could comprehend. Eleanor clarified his new duties. "Your first assignment is to report to Brenda May at the community hall tomorrow morning to help organize and serve at the Thanksgiving community dinner. You will stack cans, you will serve food, and you will learn the names and stories of the people you have sworn to protect, not intimidate. Your job is no longer to look for suspects, Brody. It's to see neighbors. That is your new job." He was speechless. This was a sentence far more complex than termination. It wasn't an ending. It was a difficult, humbling, and utterly terrifying new beginning. Thanksgiving morning arrived, bright and cold. The Cedar Creek Community Hall was a beacon of warmth and light, filled with the rich smells of roasted turkey and cinnamon, and the loud, happy chaos of a town coming together. And in the middle of it all was Brody Evans, a stranger in his own life, dressed not in his familiar authoritative uniform, but in a worn cable-knit sweater and a plain white apron. He stood behind a long serving table, his movements stiff and awkward. He focused intently on the task at hand, spooning mashed potatoes onto paper plates, keeping his eyes down, trying to become invisible. He felt the curious glances of his neighbors, heard the whispers, and each one felt like a small, sharp stone pelting his already bruised pride. Further down the line, Chief Vance was expertly carving a turkey, laughing easily with the people she served. At one point, she walked past him on her way to the kitchen. She paused for just a second. "Good work, Brody," she said quietly, her voice professional but not unkind. He couldn't bring himself to speak, but he managed a single, grateful nod. During a brief lull, he saw Brenda May by the dessert table, arranging slices of her famous peach cobbler. Wiping his sweating palms on his apron, he took a deep breath and walked over. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral. "Brenda May," he began, his voice raspy, "about the other day, at the square. I was wrong. There's no excuse for it." He met her eyes, letting her see the genuine shame he felt. She studied his face for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I know you were, Brody," she said softly. "Today is a good start." Her words weren't a full pardon, but they were a door creaking open. As he turned back to the serving line, he noticed the Martinez family who had moved to town a few months ago. Their young son, a boy of about 7 named Leo, was standing near the desserts, looking shyly at the cobbler, but too timid to ask for a piece. The Brody of a week ago would not have noticed. The Brody of a week ago would not have cared. But this Brody, the one in the apron, did. He walked over and knelt down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "Hey there," he said with a gentle smile. "What's your name?" The boy whispered, "Leo." "Well, Leo," Brody said, his voice softer than he'd heard it in years, "I have a feeling this piece of cobbler has your name written all over it." He carefully cut an extra-large slice and handed the plate to the boy, whose face lit up with a brilliant smile. Brody looked up and met the surprised, grateful eyes of Leo's parents. In that small, simple moment of human connection, something heavy and cold that had been lodged in his chest for years finally began to thaw. The weeks following Thanksgiving turned into a month. The last of the autumn leaves fell, and the first whispers of a Georgia winter settled over Cedar Creek. The change was not just in the seasons. A different kind of change was quietly taking root in the town, nurtured by the most unlikely of gardeners. Brody Evans, in his new role, became a familiar sight, but in an entirely new way. He was seen not in his patrol car, but on the sidewalks at the local youth center, listening to teenagers complain about the need for a new basketball hoop, carefully writing their suggestions in his notepad. He had coffee with the Martinez family, learning about their life before Cedar Creek and the challenges their children faced in a new school. He was no longer a symbol of rigid authority. He was becoming a conduit, a bridge between the people of the town and the police department meant to serve them. The story comes to a close one quiet morning back where it began, at the Cedar Plate Diner. Brody sat at the counter, a cup of coffee in hand, but this time he was deep in conversation with a young black woman who was organizing a new neighborhood watch for the Riverside community. He was listening intently, offering advice on how to file for a town grant. Chief Eleanor Vance walked in to get a coffee to go. The bell jingled. She saw Brody and he saw her. There was no tension. There was no lingering shame or anger. The air between them was clear. He gave her a slow, respectful nod, a quiet acknowledgement of her authority, her wisdom, and the difficult path she had set him on. She returned the nod as silent acknowledgement of his genuine effort, his painful but necessary transformation. It was not a sign of friendship, but it was a mark of a hard-won, professional peace. The final shot is of the diner. The camera holds on the quiet, professional nod between the veteran officer and his new chief, a silent promise that while the past can't be erased, the future of Cedar Creek is in more capable and more compassionate hands. The story of Cedar Creek began as so many do, with a single mistake on a cool autumn morning when one man's prejudice threatened to shatter a woman's dignity. Yet in the end, true justice was found not in the fire of retribution, but in the quiet grace of a lesson in empathy, and in the profound power of a second chance. It serves as a gentle reminder that a person's worth is never measured by their outward appearance, and that the true strength of a community lies not in its unchanging traditions, but in its capacity for forgiveness and its courage to heal together. For sometimes a new beginning is found in the very mistake we believed was an end, a place where respect is born from the humble seed of remorse,